What's going on, people? I'm Frank Persico. Today I want to do a video about my long lost 1967 Fender Deluxe Reverb and whether I regret selling it. If you can't tell by my face and my tone and my general body language, yes, I effing regret selling my 1967 effing Fender Deluxe Blackface Reverb. In 40 years of playing the guitar, there's been lots of gear, as most of us probably have this same story, in and out of my life. Guitars, amps, pedals, studio equipment, like microphones, preamps, yada yada yada, blah blah blah, on and on and on. If you are a gearhead, you probably know the story all too well. But my 1967 Fender Deluxe Reverb, wow. Well, in the end of the video, I'm going to kind of tell you what I learned from this. If there's anything at all, I don't still know yet. Maybe by the time I get to the end of this video, we'll be able to determine what I learned about selling this awesome, classic, irreplaceable amplifier. Okay, so the story begins about 7 or 8 years ago. I went out and I purchased a 1971 Princeton Reverb. And it was the first vintage tube amp that I ever had. And when I took it home, plugged it in, and started really messing with it, I realized, like, holy shit, this is kind of this is what it's all about. This is the sound. You just turn the amp up, and voila, you have that sound, right? So I went down the rabbit hole of tube amps, especially Fender, smaller combo tube amps. And at the same time as I was looking at these, tube amps, I started looking at the prices of them, and I noticed that in a relatively short amount of time, this little Princeton that I bought, I think I spent, I don't know, $900 for it, was like steadily going up in value. So I had stumbled in my readings across the Fender Deluxe Reverb. Now, I kind of knew about the Fender Deluxe Reverb, but I never really paid it any mind until I heard this Princeton. Then I started realizing, wow, these vintage amps, I wonder what, the other vintage amps sound like. So, getting back to looking at the prices, I said to myself, if I'm going to ever own a Fender Vintage Deluxe Reverb, I'm better buy it now, because these prices are not gonna ever come down, it seems. So I go down the rabbit hole, and long story short, I found somebody about 45 minutes north of me, of New York City, selling a 1967 Deluxe Reverb, and I think I got it for about $2,000. I drove up in my old beat-up car at the time, and it's funny, my car actually seized up on the way up to buy this amp. So here I am going to buy $2,000 amp in a car that kind of broke down on the way up. Like, it just stopped shifting gears, and I had to kind of reboot the car. I don't know if that's what you call it, but I pulled over, shut the car off, turned it back on, and it started shifting gears again. So I continued my journey to the gentleman's house and plugged this amp in, turned it on. It needed a little bit of work, but it was in the man's garage for a few years. So that, I kind of knew at that price, it might need a little bit of work. And it was nothing that we couldn't do. I have a buddy of mine that works on my amps. So long story short, I buy the amp, get it home, do some work on it with my buddy, get the amp sounding killer, which is what it sounds like, and here I am now, the owner of a 1967 Deluxe Reverb. So why, you ask, and I ask myself this too, why did I sell it? Because right now I sit here with regret when I think back on that amp, and I think of some of the songs I recorded that I used that amp on and how great it sounded in the studio. And I have to go back and look at the reasons why I sold it, when I sold it. So let's get into them. So for me to truly understand why I sold it, I have to kind of go back in time about 3 years. Just before COVID. So I don't know if it was 3 years, 3.5 years. It's all kind of a blur to me right now. But I was using, in gigs, when I did go out with an electric guitar, I found myself bringing the Princeton amp out to gigs more so than the Deluxe. For several reasons. One, it was just physically smaller to carry. Two, it filled the spaces that I needed filled kind of better, more efficiently. I was able to turn the amp up to a sweet spot, whereas with the Fender Deluxe Reverb, I kind of always had to keep the amp turned down because it was too loud for the venues that I play most. Okay, so I found myself taking the Princeton out to gigs, not the Deluxe. Okay, that was one thing. Now, mind you, this is before COVID. And in the studio, yes, I did use the Deluxe more than the Princeton, but I found that if I just plugged the Princeton into a 12-inch cabinet, I was kind of able to get, good recorded sounds as well with the Princeton. Get that 12-inch speaker sound as well as that kind of growly, farting out kind of Princeton sound out of the native speaker in the Princeton. So that was kind of in the back of my mind. That being said, when I would take the Fender Deluxe Reverb and jack up this, the volume and make it really cry, it did sound awesome in the studio, I'm not going to lie. But that wasn't something that I did too often. So that was kind of weighing in the back of my mind. I wasn't thinking to myself at that point in time, oh, I have to sell this amp because I'm not taking it out to gigs. But it was it was sitting in the back of my mind. It was kind of just there, and I wasn't aware of it. And then we have this series of events that kind of happened out of nowhere. COVID, or as I like to call it now, the Big C, happened. And anyone who's a musician knows all of our gigs, especially in New York City, were completely canceled. We weren't allowed to work. We were locked down, etc., etc. So I had my amps, my Princeton, my Deluxe, and we're locked up in the house. And I'm doing acoustic gigs from home, live streaming daily, just to kind of interact with my fans and my clients, and to keep myself sane and make a little tip money on the side. And in the midst of this whole COVID thing, I decided to sell my house because I was looking to get out of New York. I was fearful of the impending rising interest rates, which we are now experiencing, and how that would affect my mortgage payment, as I was in a variable rate mortgage that I couldn't refinance. And I had put my house up for sale in this kind of hot market where the prices of houses were way up, as were the prices of amplifiers and guitars. So part of the process of selling my house required me to sell off my entire recording studio that I had. I had a really nice studio, full Pro Tools HD setup with a bunch of outboard, high-end preamps, compressors, microphones, etc. So I was selling off gear to prepare to downsize and list my house for sale. I should also mention that I'd also purchased one other Fender Princeton reverb amp in the interim. So when it came time to sell the studio gear, I also decided I was going to sell off one of the Princetons, and I was going to keep a Princeton and my Deluxe. Okay. So fast forward now, COVID happens, my house is for sale, I sell all of my studio gear that I deemed non-essential to my future move, and I sold off some guitars and whatnot into this kind of high price era that we were living in, and I sold my house, moved to a small apartment with the few guitars that I kept, with my acoustic rig for my live gigs, which were now slowly starting to come back, and my 2 amps, my Deluxe Reverb and my Princeton Reverb. So as gigs started to come back, I found myself kind of back in that same situation where I was never taking the Deluxe Reverb out to gigs. I was only taking the Princeton. And now here I am living in an apartment where I really don't have the room to store the amp, and I also can't play the amp loud even at home anymore because it's just too much amp for this apartment and for the people that live around me. Okay? This is all against the backdrop of prices continuing to go up. So I have this amp sitting here on a shelf that I'm not playing, that I haven't played in probably a year and a half now, and the prices keep going up on it, and I can't foresee any future date where I'm going to take this amp out and gig with it. And at the time, I wasn't really planning on doing any major recording, and if I did do any recording, I knew that I could kind of get the sounds I needed out of my Princeton. So what did I do? I took a really good offer that somebody made me for my 67 Deluxe Reverb, and I sold it and kept just my Princeton Reverb. And I was happy with that for a while. But now, as things have gotten busy again, we're now, in 2023, and COVID is becoming a memory, I can't help but think about that amp and kind of wish I still had it to take out to some larger gigs that I'm now starting to get. So if there's a lesson here, I'd have to say it's, unless you're desperate for the money, or unless you really don't like the piece of gear per se, whatever piece of gear it is, or if you're using that sale of that piece of gear to fund something else, if those aren't what's going on and you don't need the money, don't sell a piece of gear that you love, even if you're not currently using it. Hold on to it as long as you can until it's obvious to you that you will never use it again. Now, at the time that I sold it, I guess I kind of thought it was obvious, and hindsight is 2020, so I can't beat myself up too much, but boy, do I regret selling my 1967 Fender Deluxe Reverb. If you like this content, please give me a thumbs up and subscribe, and hopefully I will be back soon with a new video. Have a great day, everybody. Take care.